which was basically in daylight by a couple of vigilantes, George Floyd by the police and very deliberately, and then the Central Park call for Christian Cooper, all together. And the thing that really struck her is not that they happened. It's that when you look at the video and look at the reports of what happened in each circumstance, each of those people who were white did so knowing they were being recorded, monitored, and believing that they were doing the right thing. That to me is the thing that really makes this much, much worse than the incidents themselves, right? These people thought they were so clearly in the right that they could do it on video and get away with it. So from that emotional engagement, we had a conversation about what I understand to be some of the issues surrounding race and systemic racism in America. Some of this is from things I've read before, some really good books on this, and what we can talk about these more at the end. But there's a great book called Lies My Teacher Told Me. And it's about how history books are very skewed in the United States. And one of the biggest ways that they're skewed is on slavery and racism and how much they omit about the realities of those things. So after thinking about that and what we could do, because that was one of the things that we talked about, is what can we do? I think most, if not everyone on this call is white or partially white. And it seems like when I had reflected on this question in the past and what I've seen reflected in news is white people have sort of an easy out in saying, well, I don't understand the experience, so I can't speak authentically about racism. And I think that's a cop-out, to be honest. And while we don't have that experience, that does not mean that we can stand by and do nothing. So to me, this is something. It's something that we could do, is at least have a conversation about it, try and learn about it, and then figure out where do we go from here. So then I chatted with Chris about setting this up, and then I talked to John, who many of you know is very involved in the dialogue on race and has been working in this field for a long time. And so John and I talked about just kind of the topics and getting us to a certain baseline, and then talked about the dialogue on race, which John said that they're looking to do more remotely now because of COVID. So it actually makes it more available. So it's something I would recommend to you all. So I'd start by saying, in terms of this, we have to have difficult conversations. And I'll tell you from my perspective, that's actually the core reason that I started the church in the first place, is to bring people together to have difficult conversations that they would not otherwise be forced to have. And to me, the conversations surrounding race can't just be about the most recent bad incident of racism, right? Because that's what happens is whether it's racism, whether it's school shootings, we talk about the incident as if it's an isolated thing. We might talk a little bit about the connection between this incident and the last one, but rarely do we ever get to deep conversation about all of the issues that surround the incident itself. And in racism, there are so many. And that's one of the reasons I think that it's so easy for us to retreat from the topic of racism, because we don't have that ability to understand the lived experience. But then it also causes us to just abdicate our responsibility for engaging and fixing the systemic wrongs that exist in our society. So beyond that, once we accept that, hey, we need to have a conversation about it, then we have to figure out what do we do, right? So I'll give you just a little bit of a story of what makes me think about this from a little bit different perspective, since we're overseas in Germany right now. So Jen and I went for a bike ride the other day and came across a random marker in the woods. There's nothing pointing to it. There's just a marker. We just found it. And it was a place where there's a mass grave of 66 Jews that were killed sometime during World War II. And then they were exhumed and moved to a more centralized memorial later in 1945. And this marker is just there. And when I contrast that with the lack of those things in the US when it comes to slavery, and yet we have Confederate monuments in contrast, it shows me something different about how we have grappled with a difficult conversation as a country. So Germany made a very distinct decision after the first decade or so, after World War II, to be very clear and clinical about what happened. So the way they teach things in the museums and monuments like this, they're everywhere. But they're very careful not to make a shrine out of it, or to give, that sort of idea to people who would unfortunately idealize what happened during that time. But it is everywhere, and it's something they have to constantly face and grapple with, the fact that this happened in their country. And as I was saying in the beginning, our history, it's mostly written out what happened with slavery, let alone the genocide of the Native Americans and what happened with the post-Reconstruction that most people don't even know about, right? They think Civil War happened, and then slavery was over, and then there was a period of time, and then the Civil Rights era happened. And the whole period in between there, which is 100 years, talks very little about race relations when we talk about our history books. Now, there are many other books that can correct those gaps, but it's not built into our system, right? We'll talk a little bit more about systemic racism in a bit. So that void leads particularly white people to not at all understand racism, the systemic disadvantages that are faced by non-whites in America. So what do we do collectively about those things? So to me, there are three kind of ways that we can engage. This is everyone. One is to get educated, right? Get educated about racism, the ideas surrounding it, and then the views of those affected by it, right? And that requires really listening, which is hard for a lot of folks. The second thing is to confront and accept the idea that all humans, but especially those with privilege, have the responsibility to fight for the rights of others. I think on this topic, I'm preaching to the choir here because as humanists, I think we understand that racial issues or issues of disadvantaged communities are human issues. They're not niche issues. And then the third thing, and this is where it really gets hard, is to fight for institutional change that's necessary to demolish systemic racism. So there's a huge amount of resources you can access. I'm in the process of writing an article kind of based on this service today so that you can reference it. And then I'm going to put things that I've found and that people have posted that I think are really relevant as sort of a primer to help you understand the beginning aspects of racism. I'm not an expert in this. I don't have background in this. To me, this is just a human issue that requires speaking out on. So first, I want to just go through some basic terms because having similar definitions is critical to having a good conversation, right? You need to understand the baseline. So the first one is racial bias, right? So racial bias is an implicit bias, right? So one that's part of our subconscious. And in this case, or in a lot of cases for other biases, but in this case in particular, due to cultural programming, right? The things that we absorb growing up in our lives, and particularly in America. And it's biases about behaviors that we associate with the external biological features that we connect with the social construct of race. I won't get into the social construct of race, but that's a really interesting read on how race came to be a thing and how different societies actually have different views on race. I was reading earlier today that there was an Iranian scholar, a Persian scholar from long ago that actually said that both white European and Black African human stock were suited for slavery. So whereas in America, we see this as a white and Black issue, in Persia at the time, both whites and Blacks were considered slavery material. So it's interesting to look at that perspective and how race has evolved as a social and scientific construct, pseudoscientific construct, I should say. And said a little bit more simply, the way we process the behaviors of people who look like they fit into certain racial categories, and another way to say it is unconscious racial stereotypes. And the thing that's critical to note here is that we have racial biases, every one of us, without question. And that doesn't make you a bad person. And you can't just say, oh, but I'm colorblind. Color doesn't matter to me. Because we're all programmed by our culture. And we see color and race, particularly in America. And saying that we have a bias isn't a condemnation, right? It's not a say you're to blame for your biases. They just are. They're shortcuts that the human brain takes to do things like detect threats. And so while we have the biases, we just have to realize that, accept it, and then work to overcome the biases, to hold them in the front of our mind instead of letting them be subconscious and affect our behavior. Which gets into our next definition, which is a racist act, right? So to act on a racial bias, whether consciously or unconsciously doing the act, right? And that might be calling the cops on Black people in Central Park or a gym. It could be crossing the street from an individual or group of Black people. It could be just different customer service standards based on race. Racial profiling, discriminatory lending, housing zoning, like all of these things. And oftentimes racist acts can be attributed not to race, but to some other thing that we could point to, whether it's qualifications for a loan, whether it's qualifications for work, whether it's this idea of fear. I was afraid, and so I did this, right? And that's something that the police often use. The police feared for their life and shot the whoever. But that doesn't make those things non-racist acts, all right? So the third thing is a racist, right? So a racist is a person, right, who is prejudiced against or antagonistic toward people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, right? Typically one that's minority or marginalized. Now, there's a really good article, and like I said, I'll post this later at The Atlantic, about how the term racist has changed, right? Racist now has become a term that means a wholly evil person or a bad person. And it gets conflated with racial bias and racist act, and we'll talk about that more in a minute, but it's a lot like labeling something as a Nazi, right? I forget what there's some principle of conversations that eventually on social media, they devolve toward Nazism, right? Or Hitler. Like once Hitler's brought into it, the conversation's over, there is no more reasoning. And the same thing is true about racist, the term racist in America, and whether it's applied as an individual or as an act, there's often a lot of defensive mechanisms that immediately come up when it comes to that term. The next thing is racism, okay? So racism, there are two types, kind of the way that I see it is there's individual racism and then there's institutional systemic racism. So individual racism is the personal belief that groups of humans possess different behavioral traits corresponding to physical appearance and generally are divided into superiority based on race. So that's an individual belief, right? So people can claim to be a racist and that's their ism, right? That's the thing they believe in. Institutional racism is different. It's not just the aggregation of individual racist acts or individual racists. Institutional racism is a systemic policy or law, right, or system of those that provide differential access to goods, services, and opportunities in society by race. This, to me, is the really critical issue that we have to get past the video of the terrible acts that have happened to then dig into what those things are a symptom of. And those things are symptomatic of systemic racism. All right. So I want to be clear on that to, again, distinguish individual racism from systemic racism. Okay. It's not just those things put together. It's not just, there are a bunch of racist people. As I saw today, there you go, Kelly, Godwin's Law. Thank you. From a national security advisor from the administration saying, I don't think there's racism, systemic racism in the police force in America. I think there are just a few bad apples. And that to me is the perfect example of how to do this wrong, right? It's not just the accumulation of those few bad apples that give police a bad name. It's the systemic policies that are in place that allow them to do the things that they do and generally do so with impunity. The next one's racial discrimination. And this one's from the 1965 International Convention for the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination from the UN. Any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national ethnic origin that has a purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life. Right? And so those are things that are generally enshrined in law or enshrined in policy that discriminate specifically based on race. That was in 1965. So I want to be clear, there's this false equivalence in this assumption of offense at something being labeled racist or racially biased. For example, let's say a white person acts on their racial bias, maybe by making a phone call to the police for something a black person is doing that if replaced with a white person, they would not have called the police, okay? That's a racist act, right? And it's enacted on or from a racial bias. Now, whether they do it consciously or subconsciously is different, right? You could assign more blame if you wanted to, but that does not make it, regardless of if it's subconscious or conscious, it's still a racist act. But that doesn't mean that person is a wholly evil person, right? All of us have done something for which we are ashamed or regretful or understand was wrong, but that does not make us a wholly bad person. The problem is that in our civic dialogue today, to name something as racist sends up this shield of defense to say, but I'm a good person and racists are bad people, therefore I cannot be a racist. That's bad logic. If you wrote it out in symbolic logic, it wouldn't work very well. But it's important to distinguish between racist acts can be done by anybody and a racist or a person who's basically declared that they believe in racism, and then separating that all from systemic racism, which is an entirely separate thing. So again, committing that racist act doesn't make you a bad person, but you do have to take responsibility for that action in the context of race. Acting indignant because you think you've been called a racist when maybe someone's just calling you out an act that itself is racist is not constructive at all, and it prevents you from taking that responsibility, right? This is where we start to get into the idea of white fragility. And so to me, until we, in this case, white people, can overcome this defensive reaction, we're unable to ever be allies in the fight against racism. So I want to talk about white fragility. So it's the next kind of piece in our definitions. So there's a book on this called White Fragility, and there's actually a paper that I'll link that's from the author that eventually wrote that book. It was from much earlier, 2011. So it's a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. And these moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, leaving the stress-inducing situation. And these behaviors in turn function to reinstate white racial equilibrium or white privilege. And then so white privilege, to define that as one of the primary, is having greater access to power and resources than people of color. White privilege is something that's really important to talk about because one, it's invisible to us. A really good way to illustrate it within a group of people who are white is to talk about sexual assault in women, right? So I've taught a lot of classes on sexual assault, and women constantly think about sexual assault and their risk of it. And they're taught from an early age that they have to take specific actions to defend themselves against it, which then leads to victim blaming when, if they don't take any of those actions, they are to blame. They should have, quote unquote, known better. And I saw a story from a friend of mine who talked to a mentor of hers who's Black, and she asked him, in these circumstances, do you have to teach your children about police interactions? And he said, yes, I have to teach them that they are more at risk of being harmed or killed from the police. Much like we would talk to our daughters, right? Unfortunately, traditionally, about their greater risk of rape and sexual assault. So that's one way to look at it, bring it to be a bit more visible. And so the thing about white privilege, though, it's not about guilt, right? It's not about you should feel bad because you're white. You just simply are. It just is a fact. It's like being born in America, right? American privilege is itself a huge privilege. We're born into a society that has nearly everything to excess. Is that something we should feel bad about? Do we have control over it? No. So instead of looking at like a guilt or a debt, I look at it like a responsibility, and a very particularly a humanist responsibility. And something I came up with while I was talking with John is tall privilege, right? Some people are taller than others. They didn't ask for it, right? It's not something they can give away, but they can do things that other people can't. So what's their responsibility then? So let's say in a family unit, I'm taller than my wife, right? I have a responsibility to provide for my family in ways that I can do that. I have a power, I have a privilege to be able to do that. And so I use it for the benefit of my family. So to look at this in terms of white privilege, it's not about how should I feel bad? How should I deliver recompense for the thing that I was unfairly given? The question should be, how do I use the power I have to eliminate the difference between my power and others? Right? I got that from John. How do you use your white privilege to eliminate it? And that to me brings us back to the original point of our conversation of what do we do? It's not just about reposting or retweeting or engaging in the conversation, though those are, steps allies can take. It's about wielding our privilege to change the systemic issues that lead to these racist acts, particularly in terms of the police, right? So you can't give it away and you can't get it, but you can choose what you do with your privilege. So that brings us to that human responsibility piece, right? As humans, we're responsible for others. I was reading, most of us aren't religious here, but the Bible has very interesting stories and lessons to be learned in it. So God asked Cain, where's his brother? And Cain replied to God, am I my brother's keeper? And that question was given to God as to distract from the fact that Cain had killed Abel, right? But the answer to that question is yes, I am my brother's keeper. I am responsible for him or her. Because we are all human, right? We are all part of the same family. And you look back at some of our previous talks on how we all fit together. So to me, addressing racism isn't about addressing a specific disadvantaged group. It's about advancing humanity. And to me, this was particularly relevant when I watched the SpaceX launch yesterday. We could put people on the moon and into space and spend billions of dollars doing it. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing for humanity. But we can't look at that advance and look to racism and necessarily feel 100% good about it. And so there was I'll pull it up real quick. There was a quote from the Kerner report, the 1968 Kerner report that examined the race riots in the 1960s. And the Kerner report did not give Johnson what he expected to get, which was outside agitators or whatever it was. The report came back and it was comprised of moderates who were aligned with Johnson, that it was racism. It was systemic racism that caused the race riots, and it was racial profiling and differential treatment. So to me, it's really important to, it's on another page. Let me pull it up real quick. Really important for us to understand that it's a human issue. So let me read you this. This is a quote from a review of the report. This is the Smithsonian. Ultimately, going to the moon was far easier than solving the nation's racial issues. Politically, spending billions on space travel was more saleable than striving to correct racial inequality. Since the arrival of the first African slaves in North America early in the 17th century, prejudice, often supported by laws, has circumscribed the experiences of African Americans. And so while the launch is human progress in the long run, that human progress is not shared equally in the short term. So they're my words now. And so we're right to celebrate the launch, but we should too remember that the hard things need to be done on this planet. So as I'm thinking about what we need to do, this is where we start. Just for accepting, getting educated, accepting that we have a human responsibility. And then that gets us to the third part, which is fighting for systemic change. In a week or 2 weeks or a month or 3 months, these incidents will die down, news cycle will move on, and people will go back to their lives. Where we are needed collectively is at the city council meeting, at the trial for the police officer in Minnesota, in writing legislation and providing opinion on legislation, in the boring meetings when it comes to zoning in local towns, when it comes to the distribution of funds to schools, voting on school millages, on changing the policies of the police, right? All of these things are going to take time and engagement over months and years. And if it's only the disadvantaged arguing for them, then they have no standing in terms of power. Because the systems that reinforce the power of the incumbent, right, the majority, which is in this case white people in terms of power and money, they have no reason to change until they're forced to do so by those who could wield power over them. So what's a really interesting thing is, in reading about this more, is the idea of affirmative action. So John shared a really good article about affirmative action. And one of the challenges in implementing affirmative action or taking anything, any action based on race, is the idea of colorblindness, right? So once the Civil Rights Act was passed, we thought we were done, right? We've declared that we're all equal. We've won the victory. Great, everything's done. It's perfect. We're just going to go on about our lives. But unfortunately, the idea that we can't take action on race, which is what the 14th Amendment says, to my understanding, could actually be hampering our overall efforts, right? Because if we understand, or if we assume that we're now all equal and therefore all start from the same position in life, I think we're deluding ourselves. If instead we look and understand that people who are minorities often start much farther back in the race of life, then we start to understand what we're confronting. How do we eliminate that gap over time? And that's going to take investment very specifically in the communities that are disadvantaged. You can't just say, oh, everyone gets the same, because they're always then going to be behind. I saw it written this way in another article. You can't all of a sudden have a credit card and pledge to stop charging the card and then be surprised when you still have a balance on it because you've never paid it off. So we have to figure out not just how we treat everyone equally or be colorblind, but to change the systemic gaps that are in place. So what I would ask from you all is, when we engage in society, whether individually or as a group, that we be there when the protests are over, that we be there for the city council meetings, that we continue to get educated and to educate others on racial disparities and issues, that we fight to change police procedures. This to me is particularly important. So coming from the military, we changed our procedures in Afghanistan to do counterinsurgency versus counterterrorism. Countering terrorism is about finding and killing bad guys, right? Which to me represents more of what the police do, right? They find and take down and often kill people they assume to be bad, which to me, in the context of the US, is extrajudicial killings. And we change our techniques because we realize that you cannot partner with a community to create a stable society through counterterrorism tactics. Counterinsurgency tactics are where you do the things like community policing, and you walk around and you talk to people. And unfortunately, and part of this is due to funding, but a lot of it is due to just the systemic racism. our police have become more and more removed from the communities that they claim to protect and serve. So changing police procedures to even say what's admissible to use, and then providing them the right training to be able to de-escalate situations, to overcome their racial biases as opposed to claiming they don't have any, is absolutely critical to changing the conversation when it comes to racism. Writing legislation is a key part of this. And this is true of citizenry across the United States, that we've become very disconnected from our legislation writing processes. There are ways to get involved in different groups, lobbying organizations, whatever it is, but this is something we're going to have to grapple with and sit with, that we have really abdicated our responsibility as citizenry to hold accountable our legislatures at all levels, from the city council up to Congress and the Senate. To me, an important part of this is to be part of the conversation, even if you're white. To speak out as an ally, and sometimes to listen as an ally, is very important. I think the listening in this case more than anything. But you cannot sit this one out just because it doesn't affect your people. Right? We saw what happened when we saw what happened with World War II, when people sat it out because it wasn't their group being held down. And again, really listen to our other humans' experiences. How is it that they live? What is it that's different from us? And while we may never fully understand it, we can get closer. And then what we can do is talk to our in-group about human rights, right? And why they're different for different groups. How did we come to this? Oftentimes, if you're going to have a conversation about racism and you have a mixed race conversation, depending on the level of defensiveness and training and education of that group, you might feel uncomfortable about asking the questions about race that you need to ask. And so we need to bring this conversation, particularly as white people, which, viewing from the pictures I see, are all of us, right? We need to bring this back to our community and have this conversation. And it will be uncomfortable as hell, and that's okay. Because we are the ones that are going to change our group with help from our allies. But it's something that needs to be done. So to close, I'll say, to fight for the rights and equality of disadvantaged group is to fight for human rights. And that's what it means to be human. So thank you all for coming today. I think we'll probably kill the recording at this point and have a good conversation. Thank you.